By the mid-1850s, Mary Ellen was one of the richest people in town. But, no one knew it because she wasn't flashy at all. She wasn't all about social status and spending her money in lavish ways. Instead, Mary Ellen actually used her money to continue to fund the Underground Railroad. On top of managing all of her businesses, her investments, and having a full-time job as a cook, Mary Ellen remained an active part of the Underground Railroad. Even though she had to leave the East Coast to avoid getting arrested, she never forgot about her community there. Besides being a safe place for those who escaped, Mary Ellen was key in arranging many fugitive slave escapes. She made sure those who escaped had transportation, a place to sleep, food, and even gave jobs to some people who were able to make it to California. Now, there was always a possibility that these workers would be found by their former enslavers. They'd get tips from those slave catchers in the area, and if they were discovered, usually there would be an attempt to extradite them out of California and make them go back to where they were enslaved before, which was of course a nightmare scenario. Imagine making it out only to have authorities come after you. But Mary Ellen made sure that they had their day in court, literally. She made sure they were represented by solid attorneys. But that wasn't good enough for her. She was determined to change the law. Now, at this time, Black people were not allowed to testify in court. They weren't even allowed to defend themselves. So she funded a ton of cases against the state of California. All of them pressured the court to change this law. In 1862, thanks to her funding all these cases, the legal team was able to change the law. It was a huge win at the time. Now Black people were able to defend themselves in court. This woman was unstoppable. Because of this, and really all of her work, she became known as the mother of civil rights in California. But she couldn't really celebrate publicly. She knew that people back east were just waiting to arrest her. So to cover her ass in San Francisco, she goes by the name Miss Ellen Smith. And people just assume she's a wealthy white landlord and a famous cook. Now, to the people who really knew her, she was Miss Pleasant. And Miss Pleasant helped anybody of any ethnicity who was in danger during those days, especially women and children. She would either house these people herself or send them to one of her many wealthy friends in San Francisco to get back on their feet. Mary Ellen was also making friends with locals who were secretly fighting slavery laws. And one of those friends was John Brown. John was a devout evangelical Christian, and he believed he was on earth for one purpose and one purpose only: to help end slavery. John was loved by many people involved in the fight for civil rights, and he spent his whole life leading peaceful talks and demonstrations with the government. Now, John was a white man, so he had hoped that the government would at least give him the time of day. He was part of a pacifist group that didn't believe in violence. But after decades of work, he believed working with this group was useless. They never got anywhere. And they just complained and planned, and it never really meant anything. He was over it. He said about his fellow pacifists, quote, "These men are all talk. What we need is action." So John put together a plan of action. He was going to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to raid a factory where weapons were made. There were tons of enslaved people forced to work under grueling conditions in the area. So John and his army were going in armed and were going to snatch the weapons from the factory to free slaves in the South. John was so confident this would work that he even wrote up a new slave-free constitution for the United States. He and Mary Ellen planned this raid and hoped it would inspire thousands of enslaved people across the South to fight back and escape their owners. Now, Mary Ellen funded this rebellion, which cost almost $1 million in today's money, and it was a huge operation. In October of 1859, John and his army raided Harper's Ferry Armory, and at first it was successful. He and his men did manage to get into the armory and snatch the weapons. But right away, his plan started to fall apart. John only brought a small group of 22 people with him to start this rebellion. He expected the enslaved people working in the armory to join him and fight back, but they didn't. Now that's because as soon as the authorities heard what was happening, they sent the US Marines. And I guess they just started shooting. 10 people were killed right off the bat. And the enslaved men knew if they dared to fight back, they'd be killed too. So when John saw this, he and the surviving men took off on foot. And sadly, only 5 of them got away. The rest of the men leading the rebellion, including John, were captured. John was charged with treason by the Virginia government and was found guilty and was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. This was a huge blow to Mary Ellen and the entire civil rights movement. And everyone was just freaking out, thinking Mary Ellen would be arrested for being connected to John, you know? Now, the authorities who executed John did find a note on him from Mary Ellen. It essentially said John had her support and she would fund their fight no matter what. Apparently, the guy who read this note needed glasses because instead of reading Mary Ellen's initials, M-E-P, he read W-E-P. I mean, thank God, right? So papers all across town sent out a warning. A man named W.E.P. had funded John's slave rebellion and was wanted for treason. Thankfully, because they're dumb, they never caught Mary Ellen. Even though Harper's Ferry didn't start the slave rebellion in the South like John had hoped, it turned out to be something so much bigger. The raid was one of the main reasons the freaking Civil War happened. Yeah.